Welcome everyone і слава Україні. До тих, хто нас дивиться українською, ще раз нагадаємо, що наша ця дискусія буде англійською мовою. І будемо сподіватися, що всім стане розуміло. Згодом ми виставимо теж переклад, відео з перекладом. So, we will start this discussion that is a part of the book forum, 31st book forum, and this discussion is organized together by Твоє місто медіа-хаб, Lviv BookForum, and Lviv Media Forum. Today, my name is Taras Yatsenko. I'm a co-founder of Твоє місто, or Your City, local media hub in Lviv and Kyiv. And usually we were, as a local media, only focused before the full-scale invasion on the local issues that are important to the local citizens. But of course, nowadays, for the last almost 3 years, we have to do many work internationally. I would start, so our today's main topic is let's win this war together. We will talk about the untold stories from Ukraine and the shared common responsibility of the media, both Ukrainian and international. And for this discussion, we invited fantastic speakers. We have already in this studio Lviv Groskop from the UK, an award-winning writer, comedian, playwright, and broadcaster. Welcome to this panel. We also have Terrell Jermaine Starr, who was one of the big speakers of Lviv Media Forum, Lviv BookForum, and is the host and founder of Black Diplomat's official YouTube channel and represents the US. Then we have Ola Merovich, who leads the Lviv Media Forum, the organization that is working with media both in Ukraine and internationally. We also have Jonathan Fink, who represents the UK, the founder of the Silicon Curtain YouTube channel that almost every week, every day, sometimes shows lots of explaining information about Ukraine and the context of this war. We also have, I hope that Patrice Moyon from West France, the editor of West France Economic Department, will join us soon. He's on the way. And we have Abdul Veli Ayub and Murtaza Hussein, who represent also the Coda story in the US, but also with the knowledge of the Eastern world and the developments there. I would like to start this conversation with the question of democracy, because somehow it happened that for the past week, democracy was one of the most well-heard words in very different events in Lviv, in Ukraine. IT Arena last week, one of the biggest tech events of Eastern Europe, or probably the biggest tech event that gathered almost 6,000 attendees, had 2 key speeches on democracy. Last few days ago, there was a visit of Samantha Power, whom we all know as a fantastic diplomat, but also now as a leader of USAID agency worldwide, and she was speaking also in her speech about democracy in Lviv. And then we come to Book Forum, where we heard both yesterday and today in the morning also discussions about democracy. So why do you think we talk so much about it recently? Why we started talking about democracy, though for many years it was already a word that was not like, it was very usual word, I would say, for many of us, but now it's getting more important. And why do we speak about it so strongly in Ukraine and internationally? I would ask this question first, Terrell Starr.
Thank you. So I would start off by saying that I think in the United States, everyone, I think Black Americans in particular, we've always talked about democracy because we've never fully experienced it. And so in our country, we've always fought to be full citizens. And as I said in one of my earlier panels, Black Americans have not really achieved full citizenship really up until about 60 years ago. So out of a 250-year history, Black people have only experienced democracy for about a quarter of that history. That's important to know. And I think that when you hear why are we talking about democracy, because everyone else feels like it's threatening them in a particular way. But I just want to be clear that for many people around the world, we have, I think democracy became a luxury to them because they never felt that it would slip away from them. And we see the advent of fascism that is some way invariably impacting everyone. So we see it in Germany with the Alternative for Deutschland, for example. We see it across Europe, and we see it with another fascist who is not labeled a fascist, but he should be, is Donald Trump. And so, and then we also see, maybe Mortaz could talk about, but like there's a lot of hypocrisy about how America constitutes who's a democracy and who isn't, whose rights do they defend and not defend. So there's a lot of hypocrisy coming out of our own government about how we, how American policing legislates the rest of the world, and who is punished for being a Democrat and who's punished for not being a Democrat. And now we're in a perilous position where in Ukraine, our democracy is at risk because, and this is the most important thing, and it was mentioned by one of the panelists yesterday that I was a part of. Take Germany, for example. She, a woman from Germany, she said that Germans really never had to fight for their freedom. Mm-hmm. She made that clear. In America, there are large parts of the American population who don't want democracy. We need to be clear about that, and we need to come to grips and really revisit the fidelity or the nobility that we ascribe to Western countries and equally equating it to democracy, when in fact, it's always been a shaky relationship with that form of government, and many of its people, many of whom have been centered at the top, in the case of my country, America, where our full democracy, where in our 250-year history, really only a quarter of that history has begun to really experience it. And every step of the way, the minority groups have had to fight for it. Meanwhile, people who took it as a luxury and took it for granted, those who had the luxury of sitting by, now have to reconcile what does it mean for them when their rights are lost, and when they start to feel a smidgen of what ethnic minorities have had to fight for the beginning of their own lives.
You said, if I heard correctly, that our democracy depends on what's happening here, what will happen. You mean the American democracy, or the Western world?
The Western world, the Western world writ large. And so finally, the thing why it's so germane to Ukraine, the reason why it took so long for Ukraine to receive its Western aid was literally because of white supremacy. And you don't think about it like this because we have this very whitewashed understanding of looking at America. And it's really simple. Mike Johnson, who was the Speaker of the House, and the MAGA contingency within it were the ones that were holding up this aid. And the reason why they were holding up this aid is because it was their attitude to their MAGA contingencies has been that we need to keep America great again, but what it really means is to keep America white again. And democracy is something in America was something that really resembled a whitocracy. And so we essentially in America, restated, the MAGA contingency in Congress, their messaging to America was, this money is going to Ukraine and protecting them. Meanwhile, we have all of these immigrants, people eating dogs and cats and all this craziness. They're coming over not only to eat our dogs and cats, they're taking your jobs, and the Mexicans are going to come, they're going to take your jobs, and they're going to sexually assault your little girls. And so we need to protect, that money is going to Ukraine. It needs to protect us from our threat. And so literally, in a nutshell, white supremacy was really undermining Ukraine's sovereignty in a very indirect way. But you're not going to be able to really have a really hard conversation about how we need to revisit democracy unless we talk about the themes of racism and white supremacy and how everyone was never being able to participate in it, and that democracy has become a hot topic because those ethnic minorities who have always been fighting to hold on to it and fighting for it, they're not the only ones. It's white people in America who realize that their rights are being threatened. And I think it's actually a shame that it's taken people across the world this long to realize how precious it is, because a lot of people have been on cruise control.
It's a very interesting point, especially in terms on the questions of how migration is becoming a very political topic now, more than like demographic or anything else. I see that Murtaza.
Yeah, to Terrell's point, I'm not sure if the mic is on actually.
Yeah, it's on.
To Terrell's point, you know, when Samantha Power says that, I have a hard time taking her seriously, because I find at the same time there's a lot of hypocrisy in the way this is applied. And at the same time, actually supports what she's saying in this context. There's a real strong reason to support democracy in Ukraine for political reasons, also for moral and human reasons. But the same activities that we're decrying Russia for doing, similar activities are being done by the US, coups and suppression of democracy, and where it's injurious to the foreign policy interests, democracy is no longer prioritized. So I think that what we want is a fair and judicious and impartial application of these principles, which are viewed as desirable by all people. And I think that people should defend that on principle for Ukrainians who are victims of aggression by a larger country. But at the same time, we're all equally human. And I think that other countries, which are unfortunately, I will have to say, victims of people like Samantha Power at the moment, it's not fair for them to be suppressed and to face this. And you see, you know, these BRICS countries, they're very pro-Russia, if you notice. And that's not right. It's my opinion, it's wrong. It's a moral inconsistency on their part. But they're negatively polarizing against the United States. And some of them did have negative experiences with the United States, which were genuinely took place. Most of them did. Does that mean that you support Russia? Absolutely not, in my opinion. You don't. You take a morally upright position, and there are leaders like this and people like this as well, too. But it's where it's coming from. There's a lot of people are upset at what they see as a double standard about the subject. So I think that we should advocate, we should listen to Ukrainians and advocate for their rights and the human rights they have, universal rights for democracy and human rights and sovereignty, independence, and freedom. But let's also then take it a step further and apply this universally in principle, so that I don't have to be skeptical when I hear Samantha Power or somebody else say it. I can agree with it wholeheartedly. That's the world that we all like to see, and I think we should move towards that, starting in Ukraine.
Thank you so much. Listening to Ukrainians, it's very crucial here, I would say, and I would like to jump here to turn to the UK, to Jonathan Fink, who definitely listens a lot of different Ukrainians in the past 3 years, maybe more. What is your perspective here, Jonathan, and why do you think democracy topic has become so strong here, and do you agree with the previous speakers as well?
I think so, yeah. I mean, having spent quite a lot of time in the 90s in the other place, in Russia, you would look at a system there that was by no means democracy. You had huge corruption, nepotism. You had an inheritance, I think, of many of the, the best jobs, the status, the prestige. That was taken by a lot of people who were coming from the old regime. But when you talk to normal people, they will point to their daily problems and say, well, if this is your democracy, we don't want to have any part of it. Really not facing the understanding that this was not democracy in any shape or form. And I think what Ukraine has shown in its struggle is that it's been trying to get out from under the sort of Russification of nepotism and corruption of decades. And for those who are, paying attention to Ukraine's struggle, I think that's the most interesting thing about it.
Do you think that we should now? What should we, as a media, let's say both in Ukraine and in Western world, do more to change this narrative to? Because Ukraine is definitely a country that is not only about corruption, and it's mainly those who come here see a lot of wonderful things going on, but in the media you will read mainly all the things that were mentioned. What do you think we are missing, and why?
I think it's a struggle that's going to sort of go on and on. And one of the problems is the sort of left-right paradigm that gets a lot of people sucked in. There are so many who are supportive of democracy and freedom, and yet when push comes to shove, they will default back to narratives and positions they're comfortable with, which tend to fit into a sort of left-right paradigm. But I think maximizing freedom, maximizing innovation, expression, and tackling the real problems of corruption and nepotism, as well as sliding oligarchy, which I think is one of those problems in the US, that cannot be tackled if you interpret the world as the sort of left-right struggle. And I think this is where there's a real challenge in the media, because the media are also very much tuned in to those stories, that way of interpreting the world, and can certainly amplify and perpetuate many of the problems by looking at them through a divisive political filter.
Thank you. Maybe I would turn here then to Lviv Groskop, so to continue the UK perspective.
Yeah, well, I think the elephant in the room for me so far is the expression Ukraine fatigue. Mm-hmm. If we're trying to answer the question, how can we stay engaged? How can we win this war together in offering untold stories, new narratives, some kind of sometimes positive thread, as you suggest, Taras, in this narrative? You know, I'm first time in Lviv at the Book Forum, and the first time in Ukraine for 20 years. And despite the situation that's going on, I feel an immense positivity in this very beautiful place that is very difficult to articulate in any kind of Western news narrative. And often tonally, it's completely wrong to talk about anything positive in the Ukrainian context. So I think one of the most important things for us is to break through this narrative of left and right, to try and break away from these abstract ideas of democracy, and to keep alive human stories, the stories behind the headlines, to revisit places that are no longer in the news. I think often Ukraine is competing with other military stories elsewhere in the world, and it's incredibly difficult for those who are interested in Ukraine and want there to be a positive outcome for Ukraine. It's incredibly difficult for them to keep people's attention, especially when, as all the panelists have said, our attention is so strongly drawn to this, what I would call abstract, often, divisiveness that is not really about how ordinary people's lives are affected anywhere, but it's about how to channel disinformation, how to find your tribe of people who are only going to have the messaging that you want to hear. You know, this is a new thing from the last 10, 20 years that, you know, if this war was being reported 20, 30 years ago, it would be a completely different challenge. But the one thing I think that unites us in this theme of democracy is that we are all struggling, as Terrell expressed so brilliantly, we're all struggling against this attempted redefinition of democracy. Different people trying to say, no, no, this is democracy. No, no, this is democracy. And no, these people are lying to you. To be up against all of that and to get out stories about Ukraine is really, really difficult. So we all need to stay creative and stay motivated to keep that story told.
Do you have any ideas, you and also to other speakers, that's the same question, because maybe week and a half, 2 weeks ago, we also had this Yalta summit, yes strategy, and we had, I remember that one of the British newly elected parliamentaries said that, you know, he said to the elites, that world elites, you often think that it's enough to talk to decision makers, and if you agree that that's what they're gonna do if they promise you, but that's not how it works in Western societies, because voters do influence. Okay, it's not the case of Russia or many other countries, but in case of the Western societies, it's where the voters will influence what the decision maker takes. And he said we have to talk to public more and more. And in terms of to continue your and his messages, what kind of creative ideas we can have to let people know the truth better?
I was going to say, well, first of all, this is going to require just one quick thing, talking about, there's a saying in American journalism, if it bleeds, it leads. Okay. And so much of the issue with Ukraine, it's only so much video and B-roll bombed out buildings and tanks and missiles that a human being can take. It's like, okay, I get it now. I get it. Stop showing me this shit. Like, and I say this as somebody who produces content regularly. The challenge and the problem with that is that even though it's indicative of how the way that American media covers wars is indicative of how it covers the news. It overplays it. Even in a lot, and y'all know, many of you have heard about Chicago, the violence in Chicago, and it's often racialized. And in fact, some of the highest rates are, in America don't come out of Chicago. They come out of places like Anchorage, Alaska, that are predominantly white. And Ukraine is a part of that overplaying of violence as a portrayal of a general portrayal of content that comes out of media that come out of the country. And so, in order to change it, to get more concretely with your idea, how do we do it, it's going to require the reader or the viewer to become more vigilant about where they get their news. And so we operate from this mainstream media complex where in America we had ABC, NBC, CBS, and then in the late 1980s we had Fox News. And the reality is that with the advent of social media, which is born out of our First Amendment of speech, it has created other content creators that actually do a better job of telling stories out of Ukraine than mainstream media. And the reason why mainstream media is based in Ukraine and tell the same dull stories, they do great investigative stuff in all those things, is that, excuse me?
In corruption.
Which is, and if you hear me, yeah, absolutely correct. And if you hear me out, that's even another kind of racialized thing, because there is a way of the way that Eastern Europeans are viewed and juxtaposed against the West. That's a whole nother conversation that we don't often talk about. And so a lot of these people come down to Ukraine and tell this perspective from a Moscow lens. And much of that is derived from the fact that in America, they are the same white people who write the same stereotypical stories about black people in their own country. And so it really shouldn't be surprising that they come to Ukraine and do the same thing. So in closing with that is that finding out, saying this way, it's mainly digital media that viewers are going to have to be vigilant about finding themselves and not being beholden to just flipping on a television set and just expecting the news to come to them. We're going to have to be a lot more persistent in our own searching of the news. And this idea of these mainstream media channels feeding you information that you need is no longer sufficient. And a best example of that comes in 2014, where I feel like there are two type of nadirs, if you call it, at the same time. The Black Lives Matter movement that started in Ferguson, Missouri, and then that of the Maidan in Ukraine. It was that was fighting against police brutality in the United States, and it was Ukrainians who are fighting against a supremacist state in Russia, and they are a supremacist state. Russia is, and I think Russians, they have to have a Russian supremacist mindset, right? And so what organizers at the Maidan and Ferguson did, or very similar, is that they harnessed social media, mainly Twitter. And so simple things like Ukrainians saying that this is not the right way to spell Kyiv. And notice it took these ornery, very, very stubborn people at the AP and elsewhere to even do something as simple as spelling your fucking city correctly. Okay? And so these were digital creators in Kyiv that forced that. And what was similar to and black people did a similar thing. One of the reasons why I became a national political correspondent was based on the activism of black people in Ferguson who are saying that we do a better job of telling our stories than you do. Ukrainians did the same thing. And you saw some of the best storytelling and media coming out of these publicly accessible tools that are digital. And so in order for us to really produce more stuff like that in the future, it's going to depend on digital creators to produce it and us investing in these independent sources of media, and also for the viewer themselves to search it. And finally, the answer is not in mainstream media, because they're the ones who continue to have this very narrow lens with a very narrow group of people from Harvard, Yale, Cambridge, and elsewhere that tell the same stories that don't actually move the public to look at Ukraine in a different way.
Thank you so much. And here I would like to turn to Oля Morovich. Or did you want to, to hear from your perspective, because how do we cope with these challenges? You cooperate a lot with Ukrainian media, with international media. We both worked together at the Perugia Journalism Festival, and I remember how like almost 90% of journalists there and editors were asking me like, okay, do you know how long Ukraine can still stand, and how much of land you're going to give away? And it means that they still don't understand that this war is not about a piece of land. It's the war about democracy, and it's for the whole world. As I think Vitaly Portnikov said at the Book Forum yesterday, that Ukraine is definitely not the center of the world now, but Ukraine saves the world now. What do you think? How do we cope with these challenges from the media side, Oля?
Yeah, actually, my first point is that we Ukrainians take responsibility for telling our stories globally. The fact that we were unseen in the whole world for 3 decades of being an independent state, it's on our shoulders. So now we have, to regain our agency and tell our stories for ourselves. What we do in particular at the Lviv Media Forum is that we empower Ukrainian journalists to collaborate with foreign media, to provide them with support working in Ukraine, also to produce their content in different languages. Still, most Ukrainians don't speak English, even like not
Ukrainian
mentioning
journalists.
other languages. Yes, and this is a problem that we should tackle in the first range. And I think that it's great, that we globalize this issue, because it's true that we are fighting for democracy, because the situation that we have now in Ukraine is that there is a gap between the like breaking the law and accountability. Mm-hmm. And the accountability is a pillar of democracy. And that's what we still don't see. After Russia attacked Ukraine, we don't see that the world is ready to hold Russia accountable. But still don't leave it behind, the fact that we are responsible in the first range to draw attention of people globally to what's going on in Ukraine, and to tell the stories that really matter, and really take into account the background of people worldwide. Like, we are very focused on our internal agenda, and the way we tell stories, it's not always the most efficient one, because people want to hear and read stories about themselves. How the cases we are telling about, how do they matter in lives of other people? How do they align with their values, with their daily like perspectives, agenda, daily life? This is what we should also take accountability for. Like, it's our role and our responsibility to encourage and, to strengthen Ukrainian media, Ukrainian journalists. Yeah.
Thank you.
What you said, that we have to acknowledge the truth, that really people want to read about themselves. And this is something I think in journalism we don't think about very often, because reporting on the news is something so immediate. We try to make it objective, and yet as readers and as consumers of content, we want things to be subjective in the same way that we expect them to be in literature or in art. We engage with these things when they affect us. I always remember when I was a young journalist, I was told by a very seasoned foreign correspondent in the Netherlands that the only way he would ever get a front page story was if the news was, there is a fire in the clog factory. Obviously they make clogs, the wooden shoes in the Netherlands, or if the tulip harvest fails, because he knows that his readers only associate a certain stereotype with that country. And I think, as you said, Ukraine is overcoming 30 years of being ignored, telling a new story, not a story that they've chosen. And what I would encourage all creators to do is to not ignore the soft stories, to not ignore telling the story of ordinary life, in a country that is occupied and is facing this, and that it doesn't always have to be blood and gore and politics. And I think that's the way to stop people outside turning away, and to make them feel included and feel as if, what is it like to live through that? How would I live through that?
Yeah, although I also I feel that sometimes people aren't prepared to read mild stories, soft stories from Ukraine, that you mentioned it, that people are still living happy life beyond the war issues, and they struggle to do this, but they still manage somehow, to find happy moments being at war, but the sometimes the brain, the human brain works in a way that if you read a story that the new cafes are being opened in the war zone, you probably think, do these people really struggle, or media just exaggerate the whole story, and the issues they are facing. But what I think media are really responsible for is to avoid these black and white pictures, and help their audiences understand the complex and comprehensive situation. It's not only about war, it's about other issues as well. Teach people think broader than one or another. The life is complex, and the stories should be complex too.
Yeah, sure. And probably then Jonathan.
Yeah, so you're absolutely correct about this. The problem is that the media, particularly mainstream in the United States, they won't do it. And the reason being is because it's statistically proven, there's studies that have shown in the United States that mainstream media, particularly local media outlets, over-report crime. The treatment that Ukraine gets is a manifestation of how Western media covers its own people. And there is one study, I can't name it, but all you have to do is search over-reporting crime in the media, crime over-reported in the media. Just Google it, you'll find a whole bunch of stuff. What it says is, one study found that in some mid-sized town, that crime had actually gone down by, let's just say, 30%. But the number of crime stories on this particular news channel has gone up by about 15% over a certain number of months. And so we have to connect a lot of in many of these over-reported cities where crime is over-reported, comes from people of color communities. And it's very, I think that is a bit jarring for when I talk to Ukrainians about this, because there is a bit of, I don't want to say naivete, I think that's a bit too strong. I think that because America is such a big supporter of Ukraine, and because many of the people that you see come here tend to be white males, they don't have to endure all of the different levels of the ills of the society like people of color do. And so I just see the faults in it, and they're not, and I see the faults in how they cover me, and I see so much of it in Ukraine's coverage. And so the alternative to really doing that is figuring out financial models so that people independent of these media outlets can do it. And one brief example is that in Ferguson, what really made the activism and really made a change for independent media in America, it came from streaming. And so there were activists who weren't journalists who just put up a live stream of themselves going face to face with riot police. And interestingly enough, one foreign dynamic of it was were activists out of Palestine who are teaching the black activists how to use tear gas. Okay, and so and my point to you is that these structures that we want to do better have not shown a propensity to do better. And I just think that we need to think outside of them. That's all I'm saying.
I want to make a very quick point, if I could, relevant to this. So obviously you mentioned earlier a very good point that you're speaking to the public of different countries, not just elite decision makers. And there are many different publics that you want to speak to when you're in wartime. You have different stakeholders, but especially the United States is very important in this case because the US is an election coming up in November. The two candidates have evinced significantly different views about what their policy towards Ukraine could be. So you need to speak to the US public in a way. And I think that there's a specific way, and it's not exclusive to the US, but a specific way you would like to talk to people in the US when you're trying to reach them with a message. And you know, if you look back at the course of the war, the thing that really piqued Americans' interest in the war in Ukraine was something which is successful, which was the performance of the Ukrainian military in 2022. Because they did very well against the Russian invasion initially, and that was surprising to people. They like a good story. Americans like winners. They like a story of success. So if you want to engage people in a long term of attention, and Terrell mentioned accurately that, you know, there's only so much rubble and the stories of death and so forth. People do get fatigued of that, not because it's not important, just because that's just the human mind is like that. You need to showcase stories of successful things which are happening. So what's happening in Ukraine is successful. And it doesn't have to be a trivial story about the restaurant opening or something like this. It could be real stories of things which are good and important, and say, okay, there's a reason you should care about this because there's something successful happening here. People are competent here. They're building something good. I came to Ukraine for the first time now. I saw a lot of things which are positive, and it made me have an emotional connection to the place and the people. You want to generate a positive emotional connection such that it's not purely a negative story. Secondly, Americans and all people, and I'll be very quick about this and you want to move on to the next question, but they also respond to things which are in their interest or perceived to be in their interest. The negative, you know, anti-supporting of Ukraine narrative in the U.S. is economic based today. It's very trivial and it's very superficial and it's not correct in its facts in many ways. But you would like to say to them, okay, this is in your interest to support us for this reason too, because it's a success story for this reason, but also there are material interests which are served by doing this. So you have to think with that in mind, and then in that way you can fight against fatigue and get people more emotionally involved, and also have a more durable sort of presence in people's minds that they would like to continue engaging us in policy towards you.
It's also really interesting because I remember just recently there was one off-rec meeting with one of the persons from the U.S. who served in different governments, democratic governments, and he said that American voters, when they vote, they don't care too much about foreign policy. They do care about the price of the burger, etc. So that's that corresponds to what you said. But what happened? Like, what changed? What from your perspective changed in the following year or 2 years, when all these like bad stories about not only about rebels but also about like most recent story that showed many people was in the Washington Post about the family that died in Lviv. It was in Washington Post just a few days ago, about the 3 children, 3 daughters and a mother who died and only father survived. It was right 1 month ago in Lviv. It happened after a missile strike. But we don't have too much of these strong stories that you are telling. What happened later after this first year of big stories, of strong stories about strengths of Ukraine? What do you think has changed?
Well, I'm always amazed by the British obsession with Zelensky. It never goes away. It only gets stronger. Only this week there's a 3-part documentary about Zelensky. That so many people who have said to me, oh, I'd stopped thinking about Ukraine. I'd stopped thinking about it because it's too depressing. And then they'd watched this documentary and wanted to talk about Zelensky and how amazing he is. And I know there's a lot of different narratives in Ukraine about the complications of these things, but I completely agree with you that good news stories and success stories, perversely, although there is this powerful, if it bleeds, it leads narrative, certainly in British context, the biggest hits in journalistic terms to come out of Ukraine are the heroism of the people and of Zelensky himself, the Kursk incursion, which had huge take-up in British print and broadcast media, and it continues to be a story, anything that represents success. And then these viral sort of citizen journalism or military citizen journalism moments, like the picture of the tank, you know, the video of the tank being dragged by a tractor. People will share that who don't necessarily even normally follow foreign news, or the moment, you know, that fuck off Russian warship moment. These become huge moments that have just been generated by a citizen creator. So for everyone who's working in the media or wants to generate these moments, always to be thinking about, you know, what's a moment that is inspiring, that can really rally people. I have to say, I really feel for Ukrainians, because it should not be your job to also sell this story and to make it interesting to people. You know, you have enough exhaustion as it is. But unfortunately, you know, this is your job. And I think it's our job as, you know, media creators, writers, artists, journalists, outsiders, to also continue to be innovative and creative in engaging people's interest in this subject and being sympathetic about the level of fatigue that people feel from news generally.
Jonathan, despite this level of fatigue, and especially in the UK, you still manage to bring more and more audiences, more viewers to your channel, though you don't speak about you don't speak that much about bad things, but mainly about constructive and positive things. What are your tips, secrets? What would you, how would you reflect on this discussion?
Well, I think there's a couple of interesting things about that, and the growth of the channel is almost swimming against the tide, I have to say, because I put out a video almost every single day. It's in a long format, which is very testing on people's patience, and I think the process of doing this has highlighted some of these structural problems with the media, both the legacy media and actually shared by digital media as well. And that is, I can already tell what stories are going to do really well and what aren't, and in some ways it, I think, reflects some of the challenges of legacy media, and the commercial pressures it's under. So the algorithms have, I think, taken some of the problems of legacy media and have actually made them far worse, because they're based on two things. The algorithm favor things that are happening right now, things that have an immediacy. So those who are covering what's happening on the front, the sort of minor changes on the front, things that are immediate, things that are very impactful, like you said, like the Lviv family, and of course Kursk had a huge impact. So if it's happening now, it gets a lot more traction. If it's clickbaity, that also gets a lot more traction. So I think it's like traditional media, but absolutely on steroids. One of my benefits is that I can put material out that will not, make any money. And I'm not dependent on that. I'm able to say, okay, we're going to put some stuff out that I believe in, but it's more popular, it's more immediate, it's more impactful, and other stuff which is not going to get any traction. And unfortunately, it's fairly easy to predict. If it's about long-term changes, for instance, creeping oligarchy, or the processes in Ukraine of, democracy trying to free itself from, Russification, as it were. These are long, slow, grinding processes, which the algorithm does not favor those kind of conversations. If it's about culture, that's not going to do well. If it's a woman I'm interviewing and not a man, that is typically not going to do as well either. So there's fairly predictable things. And unfortunately, it's also, if it's somebody of color, and they happen to be a woman, and it's about a complex topic, you just know that that is not going to get the same traction. But I'm free to put those things out, and I try not to come at it from, a particular expectation of what the audience's narrative is that they want to hear, or what sort of politics or editorial requirements. I come to it in a process. I'm trying to learn, and I'm not a journalist. I'm an activist. But I'm trying to keep a sort of open mind on many of these topics. And that's a kind of luxury I've got in my particular medium. That I think is very difficult to translate though into sort of a mass media format.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah,
Another key, a basic fundamental issue is that we don't have a popular imagination for Ukraine. What does that simply mean? There are many Americans who will never go to France, but we know we can taste French wine, we know French food, we can talk about our favorite films, and some of their or it could be the same thing for Britain or for Spain, but some of their words are in our lexicon. And so there is a sustainable interest that American audiences can have. It could be about China, Chinese, it could be something as simple as food. There's a Chinese restaurant almost everywhere in part of our, in many of our cities. Whereas with Ukraine, it's one of those places where there is no pop cultural references that we have about it. There is no social iconography that we can think about when talking about Ukraine. So also what's equally important is to support Ukrainian art and support Ukrainian culture, because even though it's considered soft, I don't actually think culture is as soft as we make it out to be, because I think not understanding Ukrainian culture contributed to this false narrative that Ukraine would fall in 3 days. Okay, that's one thing. But I think that it comes a lot with being patient with Ukraine. So we spend so much time talking about the challenges, but I also just want to say that Ukraine has done so much for itself, and the fact that even with this forum, right, just in so many years, I've been in Ukraine for 15 years. On and off, right? And I've seen this country grow, right? So when I hear the corruption stories, it's bullshit. There were times when I was running into police officers who I literally had to pay straf to, whatever, right? Like I've been and done that with with the Ukrainian.
We don't explain the difference. How much
it's a different
change.
I don't recognize this country from 15 years ago, and so we have to actually not only just working on a media journalism standpoint, but also from an arts standpoint, so Ukrainians can represent themselves to the world, and so that we can develop that pop culture reference and that popular imagination for them, so that their relevance in our minds step beyond these stereotypical tropes that we expect to evoke a type of reaction via media from.
Prominent Ukrainian writers and poets Serhiy Zhadan said today in his panel at BookForum, we can't win this war without a strong presence of Ukraine in the world. And let's listen to Chinese perspective. Yeah, that's because we focus mainly on Western world. Yeah, and we know that we have so much in common with, especially with your experience with Uyghur and let's hear your reflections.
Yeah, let's talk about this from a Chinese perspective. Like I went to the street yesterday, and I just wanted to buy a cable, Apple cable, and it's made in China. And I said, because of it's made in China, I don't want to buy it. And the lady said, why? Because China is helping Russia in the war. That's why I don't buy it. This is a really simple reason that why we are here, why we are talking about this. Because yes, like there's an international sanction on Russia, but China and Russia, they exchange like together without dollars. Like Russia export their oil and China give their weapon. They don't need dollar for this. So this economic sanction didn't work because of China. And so like when this war started, actually it started when Crimea annexed. It's 2014. At that time, Xi Jinping started committing genocide against Uyghur. At the same time, it's happened at the same time. When Putin annexed Crimea, world didn't take that collective action. And then this war happened. And then there are up to 3 million people in concentration camp. And then those people producing those Apple cables for a very cheap price, and then we are buying. At the same time, we are supporting China, and they are supporting Russia. This war also, this kind of like weak cycle, evil cycle. It's recycling like this. And another that yes, we are talking about this war. Yes, this war is just like a turning point of the history. Our, not only Ukraine in danger, our democracy in danger. The reason is China united with Russia, Iran, South Korea. They are in the same, working at the same time, working together. And that's why we have a hard time to defend ourselves, because of they are united, but democratic world not united. For example, for this economic sanction, and European Union and US didn't take the same step.
What we as a media can do here? Yes, it's a very good example. We buy products made in China in Ukraine. People coming from Western world, from the European countries, will also buy it here. Or we have rockets, missiles shooting Ukraine from Russia that have parts from very different countries, like many from France, for example. I hope still our friend Patrice will join us. How do we as a media? What should we as a media? What can we do anything here as a media? To make this shift, to make the people change their behavior, the public?
Maybe, yeah, I would add to the to this dialogue, saying that in my personal opinion, media should talk about consequences, not only about facts, but giving the audiences like longer perspectives of what's going on, and what will be the consequence of a choice made, of a choice or a choice not made, and I think that the democracy gave this space for people being more more kind to each other, more living in a space where okay, something could happen, and like the consequence, in the autocratic regime, the consequence always follows a deed. In democracy, not. We are too weak to respond to the issues that we face now. And I think that media in this particular case should go back to talking about consequences without being afraid of audience reaction, because audiences don't want to hear about bad consequences. They want to read about good stories. We talked about it today, that, you know, audiences are looking for success stories, for good cases, you know, for something inspiring. But if media talk about how this or that would influence your daily life in the near future, I think it would be very helpful for the democracy in general, for the case of Ukraine, but also, you know, for the mankind. We just missed, you know, this somehow meanwhile when enjoying democracy as something which is granted.
Great point. We have to draw the future, our future, and different futures possible, different options possible.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
What examples of Western media have you seen that you feel, regardless of what it is, that you feel do a good job of telling the stories of Ukraine in a complex way? It could be something as simple as video presentations on social media or whatever. I just want to know from your point, what have you seen? I'm just thinking, so for the rest of us to...
Very good question.
I would maybe not relate to the Western media, but I would relate to the work of Ukrainian journalists working for Western media, which I think would be relevant. Natalia Humenyuk she's a prominent Ukrainian journalist, but also a leader of public interest journalism lab. She published an article, I think, in The Atlantic recently about the general situation in Ukraine with like all this campaign of drawing men to the army. And she was so brilliant in explaining the layers of the problem that she got so many feedback from her colleagues from other countries, you know, so they weren't aware of how complex this situation is. It's not about black and white again. It's about, you know, keeping economy working. It's about also about, you know, keeping army fighting. It's about you know, making young people staying in Ukraine. It's so many, you know, this problem has so many layers, but nobody explains it. And being a professional journalist, but also being a Ukrainian, she was able to do this. I think it's a brilliant case, and it's how this job could be done.
Why do you think Western media don't hire Ukrainian journalists to be bureau chiefs? I'm sorry, I just had to...
The response...
We're stealing the questions from the audience already.
Yeah, the response is that they don't trust Ukrainian journalists. They don't find them professional enough to do this job. And
let me ask this question. Yeah, I have my experience.
Sure.
Yeah. It's really interesting that I always write a report about what's happening to Uyghur people in China. And like when I... before I submit my report to them directly with my name, and it didn't get international attention. And recently, I wrote a report, and I submitted that to Human Rights Watch. Not my name, under their name, under Human Rights Watch's name. And it get international attention. Even BBC reported about that. Because we are telling our story, like Uyghur tell Uyghur story, they feel, yeah, they are biased. They always tell their story, become like victim story all the time. If you let them tell your story, it will be more, get attention, it will be more trustworthy.
So the challenge is now how to make, the solution is to make this combination, great combination of both Ukrainians and people from all over the world, journalists, working on creating something together. Because I remember from the early days after invasion, most of the international journalists stayed in Lviv for the first 2 months. And when they reached to us and asked us for some help, explanation, but they were having very weird, some of them were having very weird questions, like one of the Pulitzer Prize winners was asking, he was looking for Nazis here, and I realized that they were not understanding the context, and we were trying then to bring people here to make this explaining Ukraine sessions, but many of them were, I was just feeling that they were kind of not trusting, just like Oля said. It was, I don't think it's about professionalism, but it's mainly about trust that we might be biased.
You don't trust people that you don't know. Like, let's make connections. Let's be proactive in it. I mean, Ukrainian journalists should do their job as well. But also, I think that we do, we do have professional journalists that contribute to the media coverage in abroad, like in other countries. But also we should encourage more and more journalists to do this, and we should bring to the table an added value. This, local knowledge, the background, which Western, not Western, global media lack. They lack it for a natural reason. That they, most media worldwide didn't have offices or reporters in Ukraine before. Nothing interesting happened here before the full-scale invasion for them, And it's, it's not the process that could be finished overnight. It's a long way is ahead, and we should be consistent enough to go it, to suggest something, to propose, but also to be open and to hear the feedback, because I believe that it could be an issue that some journalists might be biased. But we are, open enough to hear the feedback and, to respond to the questions and to give more, data-based reporting from Ukraine. And that's why we work, actually. And I truly believe that, we already see this shift. It's not as clear as it is expected, but still we already see this shift. Yeah, for example, Libération, they open, they work with the local reporter here, and I believe that we will have more and more cases like this in the future.
I think do you all notice, like, you, the Ukrainian, me as a black person, you as a Uyghur, we have the same story about people not looking at us as being equal. And this comes from a very top-down standpoint. And what's interesting about Western media is that they usually have Russian immigrants that are telling the stories.
By the way.
And I think they do a shit job of translating Ukraine. And I definitely, it's not my place to kind of look at it from Ukrainian perspective. I'm not Ukrainian. I genuinely feel like there's so much subjugation of Ukrainians, because I had this experience, it's like they don't tell that, they look at you just like looked at me, just look at him. I mean, I think this bias thing is weaponized against us in many respects. And coming from Black American media, because that's where I started. Coming from the Black media tradition, it comes from a perspective that we're not, like in an American context, we're not depending on the white man to tell the Black person's story. And because the genesis of their storytelling was from a perspective that we were savages. And I think that even in the ways in which Western Europeans view Ukrainians is vastly different. I think we all remember that famous quote from one guy that said, oh, this is a, he was just surprised that Ukraine was, oh, this is a European city, right? I'm amazed and surprised that I saw this. And then he used this to subjugate other considered third world countries. And so I'm really a big proponent of advocating for alternative, like separate entities outside the mainstream outlet, because trying to rely on these outlets to tell our stories properly is just I think it's a useless task. But again, I come from a tradition of Black American media where we've had these dual systems, and I just wanted to reflect that how similar our stories are in many respects.
I remembered Ali Maliv, a Crimean Tatar from the Ukrainian Institute, who spoke today at the panel, said that it is extremely important today to make the decolonization of the knowledge about Ukraine.
Yeah, I think
and
what we're talking about, and this reflects what Jonathan was saying earlier about creating your own space where you make the rules about what you're going to cover, what you're going to give priority to. I think the key to all of this, unfortunately, is to have to work really hard at having all of these channels at the same time. So by all means, create your own channels, create your own narrative where you control it and you're not subject to this constant bias. But at the same time, your story about Human Rights Watch is both depressing and inspiring at the same time, because it's bad that this happened and it should be under your name, and it is under your name, but it's also good that you found a way through. So I think we have to do many things at the same time, and in journalism, tenacity is always the most important thing. Gatekeepers, commissioners, editors are always looking for a way to say no. That's their favorite word, is no. And if you can find a way through, I've heard the opposite of, oh, we don't want you to write about this because you're not Ukrainian. And then I'm hearing, Ukrainians are hearing, well, we don't want you to write about this because you are Ukrainian. So there's always a no, and you always have to find a creative way through it.
Thank you, Jonathan.
I very much echo that. And this is a point I want to bring up. I talk to a lot of Ukrainian academics and sort of journalists here in the UK, and there's a definite sense of their voices being second tier, whereas many Russian voices do not have to struggle against that implicit bias. And I think there's a decades-long imperial brainwashing that's gone on, and even the topic of decolonization, which is seen as a territorial one. Actually, it's a mindscape that needs to be deconstructed there, because Russian voices will be elevated. They will be asked in many instances to comment on Ukraine, which is not a domain that they are as knowledgeable on, of course, as Ukrainians are. There's a lot of problems there. And we have to recognize that sort of a decolonization process, because Russia has invested an awful lot of money into its soft power.
Thank you.
He's still going on.
Oh, still going on. It's been internet connection. Have you finished, or it was still, or we stopped you, Jonathan?
Finished? No, finished.
Yes. Okay. I think that's a wonderful summary of this, and we'll skip now. We have just a few minutes for questions, and but I think that the most the thing that I like most of all in this discussion is that we found many solutions. Now it's just how to implement them. Do we have questions from the audience? Yes, sure. Oh, yeah, please have the mic.
Hi, my name is Kira. I'm an American editor-in-chief of a magazine called Stranger's Guide, and I wanted to follow up on what you were saying, which is that the whole premise of our magazine is to deliberately and almost unilaterally publish voices. We cover different parts of the world, but we publish about 90% of everybody in our magazine are from whatever country we cover. And they're incredibly well-reported pieces. So like we had a piece, we did a whole Ukraine issue right after the war, the latest war started, and Natalia Gumnuk wrote a piece for us about a women's prison and how women could keep their babies in the prison and how the war, you know, the fighting was coming closer, which I wonder would be called a soft story, but feels like an incredibly complicated way to look at the entire culture and the war as it's intricate to daily life, which is how we go about it. The reason I was getting so excited is because what we've had to struggle with is showing a kind of legitimacy, right, to an American audience. And we have done this by creating editorial boards for each country that we work in, made up of academics, writers and thinkers from that country. And it's actually been incredibly successful, so much so that The Atlantic and Harper's and other magazines call me personally all the time and ask for recommendations of journalists around the country. So I do truly believe, like, Trell, I hear what you're saying. You have to, the narrative of how journalism is told, the power structures, they exist so strongly. We have to recreate them and then show that we recreate them well. And ideally model that to like change the way in which stories are told, like turn it on its head. And it is possible. It's, you know, it's not the New York Times, but it's possible. All right, that's all I gotta say.
Oh, so it was coming. Thank you. Any more questions from the audience? I'm very thankful to all the speakers for this wonderful debate, wonderful discussion, and for trying to be, though we're from all different parts of the world, but trying to be really together. And that's what was in our title. Let's win this war together. And I do believe that we will do it as soon as possible. Thank you. Thank you very much.